if we're going to be mechaber them properly. We should not think it's just that they need a glass of water and therefore we go get them a glass of water. It's the way you get them a glass of water that also counts in this mitzvah.
Welcome to Rebbi, I Have a Question, a podcast from Chappelle's and Midreshet Rachel V'Chaya. I'm your host, Donna Margolis, and in each episode, I sit down with Rabbi Yitzchak Shurin to explore one question sent in by a student or an alumna. Questions about family, relationships, identity, and the lifelong journey of becoming a Torah Jew. With over 4 decades of guiding students, Rabbi Shurin brings Torah wisdom from our sages, life experience, and the teachings of his grandfather, Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky Zatzal, to some of the most sensitive and personal issues we face. You may be surprised by what you hear. Let's begin. Hi, Rabbi Shurin.
Hi, how's it going, Donna?
Great. It's great to be back. It's been a while since we've done a podcast together.
Right. True. I'm ready.
Yeah. Okay, good, because we have a really important topic today. You ready for the question?
I hope so. It's a difficult topic. It's not easy, that's for sure.
Yeah. So the truth is that it's actually, I'm not just reading like a question from one of our alumni today. I really took about 3 questions that were on related topics. They all have to do with Kibud Av V'Eim, the mitzvah of Kibud Av V'Eim, and in general relating to particularly parents. That's what we're going to focus on today. So I'm going to sum it up, right, and categorize this week's podcast with the following. So today's question touches on one of the most foundational and most emotionally charged mitzvot in the Torah, Kibud Av V'Eim, honoring our parents, and specifically, how do we live this mitzvah when geography, life choices, and the generations don't line up so neatly? So let's start with this. You ready?
Sure.
Let's begin. So Kibud Av V'Eim is one of the central mitzvot in the Torah, and for many people, it becomes especially complicated when parents live outside of Israel and their children are building lives in Israel. So to be very specific, should honoring one's parents be a significant factor when deciding whether or not to make Aliyah? And then for someone who does choose to live in Israel, what does fulfilling Kibud Av V'Eim properly look like when you have physical distance?
Okay, so, it's a great question, and it's not an easy question, and many of our alumni have had to deal with this, and some are even dealing with it as we speak. I want to just say that as an introduction, in this particular area, I have to use what Rabbi Yaakov used to say, what I think in the name of the Chafetz Chaim. It's not enough to be right; you have to be smart. Okay, so that's going to cover really that has to be like the bottom line in all the issues we're going to deal with today. Is we got to be smart, we got to be emotionally intelligent when it comes to this. Okay, and that's what I think the Chafetz Chaim meant, right? Not enough to be right, correct. Let's say according to halacha, you have to be smart on how you work things out. So let me start by saying that. The Rambam's language is an unusual language for Kibud Av V'Eim. He writes, Kibud Av V'Eim mitzvah aseh gedola. Okay? I don't know of another place where he starts a mitzvah out with, that mitzvah is a mitzvah aseh gedola. So that means it's extremely important and extremely a sensitive mitzvah. Like you mentioned, they're emotionally powered mitzvos. There are some, and one of them is certainly Kibud Av V'Eim, and we have to take our parents' emotions into account if we're going to be mechaber them properly. We should not think it's just that they need a glass of water and therefore we go get them a glass of water. It's the way you get them a glass of water that also counts in this mitzvah. Okay. And I don't know if we should say it over, but maybe it'll bring out something if we say over the story with Rabbi Yaakov. Even though it has been written up, the story with Rabbi Yaakov, I mean, like, I think we wrote it up on our monthly, when we put out HaChodesh. But I think it's worth to say over because there's a stress there that I didn't stress in that story, which needs to be stressed. A fellow came to Rabbi Yaakov about tshuva, and his parents wanted him to come home for Thanksgiving. And he was learning in a yeshiva in Monsey, about tshuva yeshiva. And he was really learning well, and he was a big masmid. And his parents, of course, secular parents, we know what Thanksgiving is to secular parents, right? It's not second even to Rosh Hashanah, so to speak, right? So they asked him to come home, and he went to Rabbi Yaakov because he felt his rabbi told him, I can't make this decision, you have to go to Rabbi Yaakov. And he went to Rabbi Yaakov, and he asked him the question. And Rabbi Yaakov quoted the Rambam. He said, the Rambam says, Kibud Av V'Eim mitzvah gedolahi. And you know that celebrating Thanksgiving is a little Aveira. And a big mitzvah outweighs a little Aveira. Now, we have to take into account that he was studying Torah. And yet Rabbi Yaakov told him to fly home for the weekend, okay, where he wasn't going to exactly sit and take his shas out of his cabinet and learn Torah, right? So here you have a case where Rabbi Yaakov sort of overrode his hasmada in Torah and learning Torah in order to do Kibud Av V'Eim. So I just want to start with that to make sure that we realize no matter what mitzvah we're talking about, and of course here we're talking about a very significant mitzvah about Aliyah and living in Eretz Yisrael, right? And of course, halachically, you're allowed to make Aliyah and go to Eretz Yisrael even if your parents are against it. But that being said, I said it's not enough to be right. You have to be smart, okay? So of course, one has to talk this over with their parents. If they decide or to think about making Aliyah, they don't want their parents to find out a day before they get on the plane, right? And they have to sit and talk to them about this and, try to convince the parents as much as possible that we're going to be in touch. Our children are going to be in touch, right? They have to make sure that the children are on Zoom, and not that they're on Zoom with their grandparents. They really know who their grandparents are. In other words, they're on Zoom enough and they share enough with their grandparents, grandparents share enough with them that they're real grandparents. And when the grandparents see them and they see the grandparents, which of course is something that's also very necessary, that if the kids can afford it, they should fly home, right? In other words, as much as they can afford, both with regard to, being working and being able to get off from work and also afford financially, right? And sometimes parents are well-to-do and they'll fly the whole family in. Sometimes they're not so well-to-do and the children have to pay. So again, according to halacha, the child doesn't have to pay to go to America. But if they do have the means and the parents don't, then certainly they should, they fulfill the mitzvah of Kibud Av V'Eim if they come to America with their own money. They don't take the parents' money. Otherwise, there's also an option to bring the parents to Israel. When there is that option, it's a great option. It actually is cheaper than, a family of 4 and 2 parents, right? To bring the parents to Israel. And it's generally easier for the parents to come, especially at certain ages when they're semi-retired or retired. And that is, something that if they can work it out, they should work it out. In other words, everything has to be open here, Donna. Everything, meaning, everything has to be presented, the different options. And what would the parents think is the best option, right? If at the end of the day, the parents say, look, you became observant, right? We lost you a little bit when it came to that. And we were always afraid we'd lose you to Israel. And of course, we're losing our grandchildren because children could do no right, but grandchildren could do no wrong. We know how secular parents are to their grandchildren who could have pay us down to the floor. It doesn't even matter. Okay. The grandparents are so proud of them and they love them and they miss them. And it's very, very hard. And there has to be a lot of emotional intelligence here, certainly feeling with the parents' difficulty that they're losing their kids to Eretz Yisrael, something that they probably were afraid of all the time, in many, many cases. And that has to be taken into account. If at the end you have to put it off for any reason, that is parental reason, you have to put it off. So I would probably tell them to put it off till the parents could get used to it, little by little. By the way, if the whole family can't come, at least the child should come. In other words, the daughter should come or the son should come to the parents as many times a year as he can do that. Okay, that's extremely important. And the times that you can't, of course, because our communications today are so great, right? We almost feel like we're in the same room, even if we're far away. That's what should be. And, if the kid gets a good mark on a test or gets this week he was, the outstanding child in the class for Midos, that has to be shared immediately with the grandparents, not just written, but he has to be put on. It's good for the kid. And it's wonderful for the grandparents to be able to see that,
and then in terms of the specific aspects of fulfilling the mitzvah, like if there's a parent in need, for example, or a parent takes ill or whatever, then it sounds like what you're saying is that the child should go to great lengths in order to be able to be there for the parent.
That is correct. That is correct. We've had cases where recently I had a case of a couple that moved to Florida because her parents were old already and they need them in Florida, and they moved a 15-minute walk from them. I don't remember if they may not have lived in a religious area, but they moved 15-minute walk from them. And they simply, because the way they work, they could work, online and stuff. And they felt that they had to do it. And I encouraged it. I said, if you can do it without, in some shape or form, threatening your job, right? Your job won't be threatened. So certainly that's a thing you should do. And again, I feel because that mitzvah is such a great mitzvah, we have to do it lemahadrin. We can't be yotza, because mitzvah gedola means it has to be done lemahadrin. Okay, and that's why this couple actually sold their house in order to be able to buy an apartment in Florida, and I thought it's a wonderful thing to feel that type of Kibud Av V'Eim.
Okay, so that was very, very helpful and a great foundation. Now let's take the aspect of geographic separation out of it, and let's talk about something else that is often very relevant to the people that listen to this podcast, which is that we know that in many of our families, many of our alumni and the people that are connected to us, the parents and the grown children don't always live the same kind of lifestyle, right? And as much as we try and as much as we hope, there are many situations in which parents that are getting older and that maybe the child would want to fulfill this mitzvah and to do it lemahadrin, as you put it. But nevertheless, the parents can be challenging. Let's just put it that way.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
It can be a very big challenge to do the mitzvah because they don't often, not often, but there are times and many times, right, where the parents don't fully respect their children's religious choices, their children's way of life. And they often have expectations or sometimes even demands that the child would be very challenged to be able to meet. So again, geography aside, but in those kind of situations, what do you recommend in terms of boundaries, no boundaries? Should they still try to do it lemahadrin, and so on?
Okay, so with regard to this, I may have a little bit of an original approach. I don't know if everybody takes this approach, but I may have this an original approach. And let me say the following thing. We don't really we don't really uh, you don't really fulfill the mitzvah of Kibud Av V'Eim, even in from birth families, properly.
Hmm.
Okay. Did I stand up every time my father got walked into the room? No. But I remembered I stood up, or my mother walked into the room, I stood up, right? But I didn't fulfill it, the way, like we say, Mahadran, right? Because, parents are your parents, and, that's, I didn't try to belittle them, right? The first thing you have to know, Donna, is that you have to keep away from Judaism. Keep away
Hmm.
from it. And if they argue with you about it, right, you have to be very careful not to criticize them. Okay. I always tell my students, when your parents think that religious Jews are robots and they don't use their minds, they parked it at the religious door, right? I always say to the students, just remember what you thought about religious people before you became religious. Okay,
Hmm.
remember that. You thought that they were robots, and you thought that they were joined a cult, and you thought they never think for themselves, right? I said, that's what your parents think. Can you blame them? That's what you
Hmm.
thought. And they're a lot older than us. And, they're not a lot older than me anymore, but they're a lot older than I used to be, right? And it's hard for them to make that change. And it feels belittling that you chose something else instead of their way of bringing you up. Okay. And that is something that you have to be sensitive to, right? So you have to keep away from religion. And if they bring it up, you have to very calmly try to answer what they are asking you, or if they're making a critical comment or some sort of belittling comment. You just have to learn how to keep quiet and go on. If you don't have a good answer to it, right? But certainly arguing with a parent is out of the question.
Hmm.
Okay. And if then you really do Kibud Av V'Eim Kemoshe Tzarich, like it's supposed to be, right? And they see how you now talk to them differently, and you see how you get up when they walk into the room, and you see how they see how you run to get them that glass of water, or that you run downstairs to get them their favorite ice cream because you see it's not in the house. That's going to soften them up, because they know that, what, this is my daughter. She's still my daughter. She took everything, all the you know educational and good things we wanted to impart into her, right? And I see she really got it. And
Hmm.
Judaism sort of just added to it, right? It didn't, like, it's not a separate, it's not a separate track. Judaism is adding, maybe I didn't get up when I was secular, but now I get up for you. It could be very helpful if the parents, number one, see how you are honoring them today. And number two, there are many things that they gave you which you can really appreciate. A lot of life smarts you can appreciate. People make a mistake. Bali Tshuva, I've seen this again and again. They think once they become frum, everything that parents taught them is irrelevant, right? That is crazy, man. It's crazy, right? You got so much out of your parents, especially if you have, like, you come from a decent home, a good home. You got so much out of it. I'll never forget a girl who came to my office, and she was dating a guy really seriously, and she wanted to know, what a good marriage looks like. And I said to her, I remember when you came to the school, you told me your parents have a fantastic marriage. So why don't you ask them? She goes, what, they're not from, right? It's like, it was crazy they said such a thing. It was like, really, that she said such a thing. I said, go to your parents. They have a wonderful marriage. Then you go to a rabbi. I don't want to even say this, but you go to a rabbi whose marriage isn't even that good. And he starts telling you what a really good marriage looks like, right? I mean, give me a break. So the parents have a lot to offer besides the education they gave you, and the life smarts they gave you. They have to know that they gave that to you. They have to know that you appreciate it, because that's
Okay,
what
but
Kibud
let
Av
me,
is about.
can I
Yeah, go
push
ahead.
back a little bit?
Sure,
Let's say
go.
you do that. You're doing your best, right? And you really are trying to show them everything. And bechol zot, it's not really making a big impression on them. And they continue to be a little bit, critical, or maybe cynical. That's maybe even a better word, like a little
That's the best word.
cynical.
Yes.
Yeah,
Much better.
or
I was thinking of
and
that word.
in I would say even worse, okay, we've definitely both heard about many situations where the parents are more than cynical and they're somewhat disrespectful. Like, like
Correct.
maybe they show the kids things that you wouldn't want them to show the kids, or they whatever. We don't have to get into the specifics, but in those cases, okay, now the parent is getting older and you want to be able to do the mitzvah, but it's really hard because they're not very respectful of you. So in that case, what is your obligation? How do you do that? How far
Right.
do you have to push yourself?
Um, I think you have to push yourself pretty far.
Mhm.
You really have to do that. I think um, the Gemara talks about it, even a mom coming over to a very chashuv person and she starts, ripping his clothes and cursing him out and everything. And he doesn't answer her, right? And that's
Okay.
that's the model we have to take is that um, you have to try as much as possible to get your mom and dad on your side and make them at least tolerate your religious beliefs and your religious life, right? But if you can't, you just have to keep quiet and allow that to happen. If
Mhm.
it's so abusive that you can't handle it, then that's where the red line comes in, that it's so abusive that you can't handle it. Then the Gemara actually says you should really move away. That's what it's
Mhm.
brought in halacha. You really move away from the parents, but you really want to know how the parents are doing. It's not just you move away and forget about them. You can send a messenger. According to halacha, you can fulfill the mitzvah of Kibud Av V'Eim through a messenger
Uh-huh.
also. So you could see how they're doing through a messenger, maybe one of your friends who's not observant, but very close to your parents, right? Maybe she could find out and know how it is. But you always have to make an attempt to um, to uh, to try to improve your relationship with your parents. If it can't be done, it can't be done. But I know a lot of cases where people thought it could not be done. But when people really worked on it and didn't let their ego get in the middle, because like you said, when the parents are cynical and putting things down, my ego has a right to wake up. But
Mhm.
the best thing is when it comes to parents is to be nichna and, feel that, these are my parents and I'm not going to argue with them and I'm going to take what they're saying to me.
I think that it's just important maybe here to point out too that there are recently a number of new English halacha books on this subject. And
Ah, great.
yeah, I don't
Sure.
often see that, there's a lot of opportunities to really learn this area of halacha. And maybe it should be because it's something that's really applicable to most of us. So I just was quickly, checking on my phone while you were talking, and I don't really want to like list specific ones that I haven't actually read, but I do have friends that have read them and have found them to be very helpful. And so I think that maybe that would be an interesting thing, to
Correct.
get
Correct.
into the specific halachos so people really know.
Right. It's a very good idea. And with one of the guys in Chappelle's, because he had so much trouble with his mom, before he went home, 2 weeks before, we sat and we learned Hilchas Kibud Av V'Eim,
Uh-huh.
and it was great for him.
Uh-huh.
He changed his relationship with his mom. He was there for the
Wow.
summer, changed his relationship.
Okay, Rabbi, we're going to keep going now. Again, also on the topic of navigating relationships with family, but taking a slightly different aspect of it. And I think that this is probably more applicable or most applicable to people with younger children. Okay, and
Mhm.
I'll ask it like this directly from the question. Many of us didn't grow up religious, don't have long-standing family minhagim, and have parents or relatives who live very different lives than the ones we're raising our kids in. How should we speak to our children about grandparents or other family members who aren't observant? And then there's a second part to it. This comes from another person's question, which, if you don't get to it, I understand, but we'll try to cover it. She asked, she has a non-Jewish father who actually
Uh-huh.
is quite religious in his he's a Christian, quite religious Christian. Um, so how do you speak to your children about the non-religious parents or even the non-Jewish parents while still modeling respect, honesty, and most importantly, a strong and confident Jewish identity?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let me try to answer the question. It is, again, not a simple question. So the first question you had was, um, these people didn't grow up with family minhagim, right? And have parents or relatives who live different lives, right, than the ones they did. So um, you want to know like how you deal with the fact that the children, I guess younger children, right, like you said, deal with, how do you explain your parents to them, basically,
Exactly. When they
right?
start to get to an age when they're noticing, like, hey, grandpa's not wearing a kippah, or, Bubby wears pants, or they're on their phone on Shabbos, or whatever the things are that they do. But,
Correct.
How do you speak to the kids about that?
Hmm. Okay, good question. Great question. Look, I think we don't want to fool the kids, okay, and make them think that grandpa doesn't wear a kippah, but he's actually from, right? If they want to leave your house on Shabbos, let them leave your house on Shabbos, and the kids will have to learn how to deal with that. But when I'm obviously thinking about these questions. The kids at all different ages are thinking about the questions. You have to simply say to them like this: you were very fortunate that you grew up in a Torah home. Okay, many, many Jews in the last century did not grow up in a Torah home, right? And it's not their fault. Judaism was much more challenging. It wasn't as widespread as it is today, in the United States, for instance, in other areas, right? And therefore, they didn't have the opportunity that you guys have. And we want you to take that into account when you have your relationship with your grandma and grandpa. We don't want you to be feeling that they're Rashaim, they're evil people, they don't keep Shabbos. They're not. They're wonderful people who haven't really studied and known and grown up with what you have. And that's you yourselves, many of our students didn't grow up with this. So we know what it feels like, And then they, of course, discovered, we'll even call it the truth. The history of the Jewish people, the Torah of the Jewish people, the land of the Jewish people. They discovered this. This is a discovery that was much easier today, or even for our students 20, 30 years ago, than their parents. Okay. Some of their parents maybe even had negative experience with, they went to Talmud Torah. I always hear this, and the rabbi hit me, or, they had negative experiences. So we can't really blame them for them, the way they are. But we have to always remember, the kids always have to remember that grandpa and grandma's love is unconditional. Okay. And that's an unbelievable thing you don't want to give up, because their love for us, the kids, might have been semi-conditional, because kids can do no right, but grandkids can do no wrong, right? So they have to realize that's such an important relationship, that their grandparents love them, right? And they really didn't learn much about Judaism. Therefore, the grandparents are lovely people, and not everything is just about Judaism. It's about human relationships, interactions with the grandparents, playing with the grandparents, speaking to them. And of course, they have a different hashkafa with regard to many things in the secular world. Many of the values are a little bit different or somewhat different, and even the culture many times is different. And that has to be explained to the parents, that, when the kids come to the house, you may not want them to watch television, but you may be okay with them watching certain videos on the computer, right? This is something that could be explained to the grandparents, right? And say, look, it's not just that Judaism is a problem. It has a problem with television. We as religious Jews have a problem with television. A lot of the stuff that's on there, probably shock the parents today,
Mhm.
if they knew what a family show was like in the 50s and 60s. Today they would be quite shocked. So we don't want to expose our kids to that, right? And that can be explained to the parents. But we certainly want the kids to be exposed to wonderful grandparents who love them, who cherish them, who are so proud of them, and they are so proud of them. The kid can bring home, I've watched this, kid brings home something that he was the best kid in Chumash this week. Now the parents don't have a clue of what that is, and they have a smile wider than the earth. Right? I
Mhm.
mean, it's such a wide, because that's the nachas that they get from them, whether they understand it fully or don't understand it. It's a beautiful thing, and that's the way I feel. I feel that you have to stress the idea of who grandparents are, and not the religious part of, the religious restrictions, because they're there, right? As soon as a kid asks a question, the answer has to be, grandpa and grandma don't know better as far as religion is concerned, but they're very beautiful people. And I want you to be exposed to very beautiful people.
I'll tell you a cute anecdote before I push you
Sure.
on the last question if we have time. Just a cute anecdote. So my kids have a grandparent now that every single time he speaks to, doesn't matter which kid he's speaking to, he ends the conversation by saying, I just want you to know that I am the president of your fan club.
That's
And it's
great.
true. It's beautiful. And for a kid,
Right.
like for each one of them, my kids are young adults now, but it still means so much to them to know that
Sure.
they have
Sure.
that love. So I really
Yeah.
appreciate what you said. Now, how does this change if the grandparent isn't Jewish?
Okay, so again, it's not the grandparents' fault that they're not Jewish. And I remember one kid coming over to my in my neighborhood, coming over to my daughter and saying, "Do you know my grandmother's a Russia? She eats pork." Now, her grandmother wasn't Jewish. Her mother was a convert. I wasn't sure. So Ruthie came home and told me about it. So I said, go back and tell her her grandmother's tzaddikus. She eats pork. She's a tzaddikus. It's not objectively bad to eat pork. If you're Jewish, it's not good. But if you're not Jewish, it's good. And I want to say, in other words, there are such wonderful. I was just at a wedding where one of the parents was not Jewish, and he's so close with his Jewish daughter, because his wife is Jewish, but he's not Jewish, but he's so close with his daughter. He speaks to her 3 times a week, and he loves, giving her advice and sharing his life with her, and her sharing his. They're great people. A lot of these non-Jewish people, they're not anti-Semites. They wouldn't have married into the Jewish world. They're not
Mhm.
anti-Semites, right?
Mhm.
They're lovely people, a lot of them. But we're not asking them to become Jewish because it's quote unquote better or chosen or whatever. They have their lives, and we have to respect that life. If they're keeping Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach, what could be more beautiful than that?
I'll tell you though, the person that asked this question in her specific case, her father isn't Jewish, and he's actually he talks a lot about Yashka and his Christian values and ideals and so on. Can you ask him not to do that around your kids?
Yes, you can ask him not to do that. You can ask him, or you could say to him, if it's a value you think that they should hear about, but we're not really, he knows very well that we don't really believe that, Mohammed was God's gift to man, and Jesus was, son of God. We don't believe that. So, if they want, they could say over a value in Christianity. If they think Judaism can absorb that, they can say it over, but they don't have to say it over the name of Jesus, because immediately there's going to be a negative reaction,
Hmm.
because it's not that we sit and talk about how bad Jesus was, but we
Hmm.
know that that's part of the religion, that it's unacceptable that there's such thing as a son of God. Moshe Rabbeinu wasn't the son of God, and he's responsible for everything in Judaism, right? So you can explain to them, of course, at a different point, not at the time, but at a different point, you should explain to them that you'd rather leave Jesus out of the equation. You'd rather leave the New Testament out of the equation, right? But if they want to tell you something they think is important religiously, because they're very religious people, right? If it drives with Judaism, we have no problem listening to that.
Mm-hmm.
With that, we could say over that idea that, they always send me on New Year's that, Rabbi Yaakov says, that Rabbi Yaakov said, were you makabel anything new for New Year's? And they say, Rabbi Kamenetsky, New Year's this is for Goyim. Our New Year's is Rosh Hashanah. He says, well, when everybody is taking on things, it's a good time for Jews to also take on things. So he's really saying is that if the non-Jew has something that they're doing that's acceptable, right?
Mm-hmm.
We could be part of that. It's not
Mm-hmm.
like automatically because they said it, you can't do it. The Sefer Hasidim writes, if you have to pick a place where to live in a place where the non-Jews have a very high standard of honesty and credibility, more than living in a Jewish area where the Jews have a low standard of honesty and credibility.
Wow. Wow, Rabbi Shurin, I know you have to get going to daven mincha, so we are going to wrap up. I just want to say from a personal perspective, it's amazing listening to you and hearing things. I had no idea how you were going to answer these questions, and just the way that you bring it all together, it just feels good, and it's normal, which I know is always your goal. So thank you so much for that. These are not easy situations. So I'll just remind our listeners that if you have a question that you'd like Rabbi Shurin to address on a future episode, you can email us at questions@darcheinoam.org. If you found this conversation meaningful, please subscribe to the podcast and share it with anyone that you think might benefit from it. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Take care, guys.